Behind these concrete walls and steel bars, death doesn't always come quietly. In the shadows of America's correctional system, some inmates have met their end in ways so horrific, so preventable, that they expose the darkest failures of our justice system. These aren't just statistics or case numbers. These are human beings who entered prison alive and left in body bags under circumstances that will haunt you long after you hear their stories. Today, we're diving into the most disturbing jail deaths ever recorded. Cases where negligence, brutality, and systematic failure combine to create nightmares that should never have happened. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand exactly how the system designed to protect society can become a death trap for those trapped within it. But before we begin, I need to warn you that what you're about to hear contains graphic descriptions of suffering and death that may be difficult to process. The stories I'm sharing today aren't just isolated incidents. They represent a pattern of institutional failure that spans decades and crosses state lines. These deaths occurred in facilities that were supposed to provide basic human care, in buildings funded by taxpayer dollars under the supervision of trained professionals. Yet somehow, preventable tragedies unfolded while cameras rolled and guards watched. What makes these cases particularly disturbing isn't just the brutality of how these individuals died. It's the fact that in most instances, multiple people had the power to intervene and chose not to. Warning signs were ignored, medical requests were denied, and basic human dignity was stripped away hour by hour until death became inevitable. The first case takes us to Cook County Jail in Chicago, where 38-year-old Jerome Murdo was found dead in his cell on February 15, 2014. Murdo, a homeless Marine veteran suffering from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, had been arrested for trespassing while seeking shelter from the brutal Chicago winter. He was placed in a mental health housing unit where the temperature was allowed to climb to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Security footage would later reveal that Murdo spent his final hours in agony, stripping off his clothes as his body temperature soared beyond what any human can survive. Guards conducting their rounds noted his distress, but took no action to cool the cell or provide medical assistance. The heating system had malfunctioned, turning his concrete cell into a literal oven, yet no one bothered to check the thermostat or move him to a different location. By the time staff finally entered his cell, Murdo's body temperature had reached 109 degrees. His skin was burning to the touch, and dehydration had ravaged his organs beyond repair. The medical examiner would later rule his death a homicide caused by hyperthermia due to environmental exposure. A man who served his country died alone, cooking alive in a government facility while trained professionals ignored his suffering. But Murdo's death was just the beginning of our journey into institutional negligence. The second case brings us to Rikers Island, New York's notorious jail complex, where 22-year-old Khalif Browder endured 3 years of hell before taking his own life. Browder was arrested at age 16 for allegedly stealing a backpack, a charge he consistently denied. Unable to afford the $3,000 bail, he was sent to Rikers to await trial. What happened next defies comprehension. Browder spent over 700 days in solitary confinement, much of it during his crucial developmental years as a teenager. The isolation was so complete, so devastating to his mental health, that by the time he was finally released without ever being convicted of a crime, the damage was irreversible. Surveillance footage later released showed guards and inmates brutally beating him while he was restrained and helpless. The psychological torture continued day after day, month after month, year after year. Browder attempted suicide multiple times while incarcerated, each attempt a desperate cry for help that was answered with more isolation and neglect. When he was finally released in 2013, The case against him was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The backpack he allegedly stole was never found. The witness never appeared. And 3 years of a young man's life had been stolen by a system that forgot he existed. 2 years after his release, Browder hanged himself at his family's home in the Bronx. His mother found his body, ending a story that began with a teenage boy accused of a petty crime, and concluded with a broken young man who couldn't escape the trauma of what Rikers had done to him. His death sparked nationwide outrage and calls for reform. But for Kalief Browder, justice came too late. These cases share common elements that will become clearer as we examine more deaths. Vulnerable individuals, systematic indifference, and a culture within correctional facilities that values control over compassion. The people who died weren't hardened criminals or dangerous threats to society. They were human beings caught in a system that had forgotten its basic obligation to preserve life. The third case transports us to Milwaukee County Jail, where 38-year-old Terrell Thomas died of profound dehydration after jail staff shut off the water to his cell for 7 days. Thomas, who was experiencing a mental health crisis, had been arrested for firing a gun in a casino. Instead of receiving the psychiatric care he desperately needed, he was placed in solitary confinement where his condition rapidly deteriorated. What happened to Thomas in that cell represents one of the most sadistic forms of torture imaginable. Jail staff deliberately turned off his water supply, claiming he was flooding his cell. For 7 consecutive days, Thomas begged for water while guards walked past his cell during their rounds. Security cameras captured him drinking from his toilet, desperately trying to find any source of moisture to keep his body functioning. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. As dehydration set in, Thomas's organs began shutting down one by one. His kidneys stopped functioning. His blood pressure dropped dangerously low, and his brain began to swell from the lack of fluids. Medical staff noted his deteriorating condition in their reports, but took no action to restore his water supply or transfer him to a medical unit. By day 4, Thomas was barely conscious. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his skin had lost all elasticity, and he could no longer produce tears or saliva. The human body was cannibalizing itself, breaking down muscle tissue in a desperate attempt to find moisture. Yet the water remained shut off, and the requests for medical intervention were ignored by staff who had sworn an oath to protect those in their custody. When Thomas finally died on day 7, the medical examiner found that his body weight had dropped by over 20 pounds. His organs had essentially mummified inside his living body, creating a death so prolonged and agonizing that it constitutes torture under any reasonable definition. The autopsy revealed that Thomas had suffered the kind of dehydration typically seen in desert survival situations, except this happened inside a government facility surrounded by running water and medical equipment. The fourth case brings us to Harris County Jail in Houston, where 27-year-old Sandra Bland died under circumstances that exposed the deadly intersection of mental health crisis and jail negligence. Bland had been arrested during a routine traffic stop that escalated when she refused to extinguish her cigarette. 3 days later, she was found hanging in her cell, dead from apparent suicide. But the circumstances surrounding Bland's death reveal a pattern of institutional failure that goes far beyond a simple suicide. Jail intake records show that Bland disclosed a history of depression and previous suicide attempts, information that should have triggered enhanced monitoring and mental health intervention. Instead, she was placed in a standard cell with minimal supervision and no psychiatric evaluation. The hours leading up to Bland's death were captured on surveillance footage that raises disturbing questions about jail protocols. She can be seen pacing her cell frantically, clearly in psychological distress, Yet no mental health professional was called to evaluate her condition. Phone calls she made to friends and family revealed her growing desperation and fear, but these conversations were recorded by jail staff who took no action despite clear warning signs. Most troubling of all, the cell where Bland died had a blind spot in its camera coverage, making it impossible to verify exactly what happened during her final moments. This same cell had been the site of previous incidents, yet jail administrators had never addressed the surveillance gap that would later fuel conspiracy theories and public outrage about her death. The pattern emerging from these cases shows how quickly preventable situations spiral into fatal outcomes when basic human care is abandoned. Whether through deliberate cruelty, bureaucratic indifference, or systematic understaffing, these facilities failed in their most fundamental responsibility to preserve human life. Our fifth case takes us to Franklin County Jail in Columbus, Ohio, where 53-year-old Joseph Gallucci died after spending nearly a month in solitary confinement while suffering from severe mental illness. Gallucci had been arrested for misdemeanor charges related to his untreated schizophrenia, but what should have been a brief detention became a death sentence. Jail medical records document Gallucci's rapid psychological deterioration in isolation. He spoke to voices only he could hear, covered his cell walls with feces, and refused to eat for days at a time. Instead of transferring him to a psychiatric facility, jail staff increased his isolation, placing him in a stripped cell with no stimulation except the fluorescent lights that burned 24 hours a day. The surveillance footage from Gallucci's final weeks shows a man slowly losing his grip on reality. He can be seen talking to invisible people, performing repetitive behaviors for hours, and gradually wasting away as his refusal to eat continued. Medical staff noted his declining physical condition, but focused solely on documenting his symptoms rather than treating the underlying mental health crisis driving his behavior. His behavior. These cases reveal a truth that cuts to the heart of who we are as a society. Jerome Murdo, Kalief Browder, Terrell Thomas, Sandra Bland, and Joseph Gallucci didn't die because the system failed them. They died because the system worked exactly as it was designed to work, treating human beings as disposable objects rather than people deserving of basic dignity and care. What we've witnessed today isn't just institutional negligence or bureaucratic incompetence. It's the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable people whose only crime, in many cases, was being poor, mentally ill, or caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. These deaths happened in facilities funded by our tax dollars, supervised by people we entrusted with power over life and death, in a country that claims to value human rights above all else. The most disturbing aspect of these tragedies isn't that they happened once. It's that they continue to happen year after year in jails and prisons across America, while the public remains largely unaware of the horror unfolding behind concrete walls and steel bars. Each death represents not just a failure of the correctional system, but a failure of our collective conscience to demand better from the institutions we allow to operate in our name. Until we acknowledge that the people who die in custody are human beings who deserved to live, nothing will change. Their names deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told, and their deaths demand that we never stop fighting for justice.